Lalo takabanga Rachel Renee New Takayal Nanginak Edwardson Utkiaravimu Apara George Edwardson Akara Debbie Edwardson Anara Elizabeth Amawak Thibodeau Apara Adara Edirak Edwardson. I am very happy to be here today, Kalina, for having me. My full name is Rachel Renee New Takayal Nanginak Edwardson. As customary, I'm calling in from another country, and as the First Nations customs here, it's respectful to acknowledge the country that you're on. So I'd like to just take a very quick minute to recognize and acknowledge that I'm on the unceded territories of the Wurundjeri nations, which is now also known as, the sort of southern part of Australia in Melbourne area, just slightly outside of Melbourne. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and my thanks to all the things that I've learned working alongside them for the last 15 years, on and off for the last 15 years. Also like to recognize my own ancestors and elders and everything that has guided me personally and professionally. And then recognize everybody else's ancestry and where everybody else is coming from. I think that sometimes it's really a lovely way to start is just recognizing the heritage that we all carry into the spaces and the lessons that we've all learned that guide what we do in our work and in our family lives and our community lives and our personal lives, just as a way of honoring both the similarities and the differences, but especially the strengths and the wisdoms that we all come from. So thanks for that. I am really excited to learn more about your group and to hear more of what you are doing. It sounds like a really awesome little conversation group that you guys have going around the work that everybody is doing in different institutions around the country and different First Nations led and Native groups. I am, as Daniel said, I'm from Iqaluit, I'm from Bear, Alaska, and born and raised in Alaska, and then sort of fell in love with film and television as a result of coming from two storytellers. My father is a storyteller and an Inupiaq storyteller, and sort of spent his life alongside, land rights and alongside social justice issues, collecting stories from the Inupiaq community all across the Arctic, the Inuit community all across the Arctic, and Native communities all around the world. It's his favorite thing to do is collect stories. So he collect these stories and tell them to us at bedtime. And so our worlds were surrounded and infused with stories from our own community and from other communities. And my mother is a writer. So she, when I was very young, started writing, actually not when I was very young, she's been writing my whole life, but she started writing children's books when I was in high school, because maybe in middle school, high school, she started writing children's books because she had a hard time finding Inupiaq children's literature for her 7 Inupiaq children, who all sort of struggled to connect with reading and writing at school, because the stories we were told and the stories we were exposed to through the literature we were supposed to be learning how to read and write English had such a different context. The teachers used to have to explain to us, what a sidewalk was and what a telephone booth was and what sheep were and different kinds of birds and animals. And, just the physical context was so different, but then the social and emotional contexts were so different. And there was very little culturally relevant literature. So she started writing it primarily to have something to give to her children so that they would love literature as well, as much as she did, because she had grown up loving to read and couldn't understand why her children, who were all perfectly, who were doing perfectly fine in school, just weren't engaging in those aspects. So that sort of informed my coming of age. And then I come from a family, an Inupiaq family in the Arctic that is, I have so many aunties and uncles and grandparents and distant family members and close family members who've been involved in one way or another in land rights and community development and Inupiaq sovereignty issues. And that was around my kitchen table when I was growing up. And I had the privilege of learning as I was coming of age, I had the privilege of learning the power that storytelling has to continue and not just revitalize, but also to continue the internal sovereignty of the spirit, sovereignty of the mind, sovereignty of the land, sovereignty of culture. And so that was sort of you know, bubbling in my subconscious as I was a young teenager, because I had been exposed to it my whole life at home. And as I hit sort of the film industry doing this, working at the very short-lived television studio that was at first at the North Slope Borough, which is a local government in my region, and then at the high school, it was this kind of mass running in a fusion of realizing the power of being able to tell your own story and being able to tell that internally for your own community and being able to share that with the rest of the world on so many different fronts. And the realization that I had had an incredibly privileged exposure at a very young age of hearing those stories, and so many of my peers had not. You know, so many of my peers, just as a result of the way things work in our histories, so many of my peers had not been exposed to our own stories and our own histories, and they were desperately looking for it, and they were hurting because they were missing it. And I realized as we sort of grew up and, you know, computers came and the internet came and cell phones came and television came, that our stories were being replaced with these stories that didn't have a lot of relevancy to our lives. And I'm not an advocacy for censoring any stories, but I'm absolutely an advocacy for maintaining and continuing your own storytelling traditions inside your own communities and for your own communities. And I started to realize that we, as a Nupar people, we weren't continuing those stories because our world had changed so, because of colonization, and also because our world had changed so fast and this new technology had come in, and it was mostly inaccessible to our storytellers and our makers. It was mostly too hard to pick up, too expensive to pick up. And I went, that's what I want to do. I want to make films, and I loved the medium. And so I went off to school and I learned filmmaking and storytelling mediums, and then I was lucky enough to come home and start making films. I had the support of my community behind me. They called me home and said, hey, we need to record the stories of our elders before they're gone. We need to put these stories onto this medium. Will you come home and do this? So right as I was finishing school, I lived sort of in the lower 48 for a little while. For anybody not from Alaska, that's what we call the continental United States, and worked down there for a bit. And then I went home and started working on that history series that Daniel was talking about. And, you know, through that, I also wrote dramas and wanted to do other films and did short films, and then started traveling back and forth and worked in Australia, all across Australia, and Indigenous communities here and other minority communities, creating capacity on the ground for film and digital storytelling and digital media, and using it as an intersection to kind of bridge this massive change that we've all been through, and as a strength-based tool to continue those traditions in our communities of storytelling, for all of the powerful reasons that storytelling is important to a society, to any society. So that's the kind of very short history of where I come from. I also have a background in education and community, you know, grassroots kind of community organizing, and I work a lot between institutions and communities to try to build bridges so that communities to help institutions adjust their practice and reform so that they can bring communities into those spaces in more empowered, authentic ways. But that's my filmmaking story. That's where I come from. So I'm very happy to kind of talk about various issues, but I also want to make sure that there's space today for conversation. So I'm really happy to take questions at any point. I think there's lots of different ways of doing this on Zoom. So if you just want to put your microphone on and ask a question, or press the little button, I think sometimes these little reaction buttons down the side, please do so. Am I on the right sort of track to sort of talk about key issues in Indigenous filmmaking? Are you guys doing that already, or? Yeah, okay. So as I understand it, you're all coming from different universities across the country with different various media programs. Is that right?
Yeah. We just had a citizen of the Muskogee Nation to film in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. Sterling Harjo just completed filming the Resurrection Dog, and it has been interesting. Extras are people we know.
Mhm.
And in one of the scenes, he has he had my brother to build the Muskogee grave houses. And the history behind that comes all the way from the forced removal from the homelands of current day Alabama and Georgia to Indian Territory, current day Oklahoma. So there's a lot of history in just that scene with the grave houses, because we do what we call we didn't have time to bury our people along the way. So it is where we use our quilts and blankets on the coffins, because that's how we had to bury our people. And we have a final handshake, which is where in that forced removal coming up the trail, it was in the winter time. And so they could only scoop up a handful of dirt. They could only pick up leaves and twigs and cover the loved one that had expired along the trail. So that comes a long way with our people. So when we see those in any movie, it's an identity for us and it's a call to remember. So a lot of what we do is commemoration of ancestors that you were talking about. We do the best we can to commemorate those events in a good way. So I really can identify with what you're saying, Rachel. That's good. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that story. That's such a powerful illustration of these sort of things that I'm talking around. And I know Sterling. I know Sterling well. We did a Sundance Fellowship together years ago. He did his right a few years before I did mine, and then he was there when I was doing my Sundance Fellowship. And I've run into him. The Native filmmakers community is relatively small in the United States, so we all sort of are benefit and lucky to know each other a little bit. But it's a beautiful illustration of the power of storytelling, the ability, if you are, when you're doing it well, when you're holding that space well, which is difficult to do because you're taught as a filmmaker, and the film industry operates in a very Western way. And I think this is one of the things that we often just don't have enough time to interrogate, enough time to become aware of. And we think, well, it's a camera, you're just telling a story, you're just, letting people tell their story. But the way that we tell the story, the things that are in the landscape of those stories, the way that we empower people to tell their own stories, and the way that we shift our industry and how it normally operates has potentially amazingly powerful flow-on effects. And that story is a beautiful story of how, in one simple thing of making sure that you are doing that right, like Sterling could have very easily just brought in a carpenter, brought in somebody else to make this, and brought in, hired film crew people who would have been used to making sets and used to doing things in certain ways, and just put that in there. But because you ground it in the community, it carries that history and that meaning for the audience. And that's the most important thing, because it has, in that one moment, it has the depth and the nuance and the ability to create healing and to further healing from one part of the history. And in that, for me, the films that I've made in communities, with my own community, with other communities, have often dealt with very difficult topics. And I have always sort of tried to ground the project and ground myself, and even if it's a difficult project, in a strength-based way of presenting that. Because I think as a community, I'll just speak for my own community, and other communities can speak for their experience, but as a community, the things that we've survived in our history are quite intense, and they're very, very painful. But the focus for me, and what I learned from my elders, is that we, is not just to honor the reality and honor the pain of those histories, but to always remind ourselves that we survived them, to always remind ourselves that the strength of who we are as a Nipah people is what got us through any one of those things. And that's what gets us through the difficulties we have now. And sometimes, you can kind of say those things to kids, or you can say those things to each other, but the message doesn't land home as powerfully as it does when there's a story that illustrates it. And I know when we first did the Duckin, I mean, the Duckin is a very easy example because it's a success story of resistance and the protection of subsistence rights in Alaska. So that one was like a very obvious walk up, easy start for a strength based story. But we were so surprised at the result of that film and the impact of that film on our own communities. And we made a number of choices on the way when it was our sort of pilot test for this history series. We wanted to cover the loss of language issues. We wanted to cover land rights. We wanted to cover, Project Chariot, which is another more difficult story that has a lot of pain and cancer attached to it. And, forced removal out of villages and forced removal of children, all of these different stories. And with the Duckin, when we were making it, we had to sort of make some very conscious decisions. Were we going to make it, aim it at young children and therefore use the kind of tools of like MTV, which was very popular in those days, and kind of fast editing and fast music, which we incidentally didn't actually have the money for. So it would have just meant that I needed to work, 30 hours a day instead of the 26 I was working to get it done, because I think we made that film for about $4,000 and, I don't know, it was something ridiculous that we had, the original budget we had, because it came out of the school district and, nobody knew what we could do at that point. But we knew that it was important. And we had to make a decision. Are we going to edit this? Are we going to edit it down for young people, which I firmly believe that we didn't have to do. Like, I don't think you have to speak down to teenagers. I think that you can present them with content that's engaging and relevant to their information, and you can actually sort of give them a bar that they will climb up to themselves. And so we didn't do that, aside from the fact that we didn't have the money. And then we had to make another really important decision on that film when we filmed with all the elders that we could find who'd been part of this event. And then we had to decide, are we going to go to the University of Alaska Fairbanks or the Federal Fish and Game Wildlife Department or any of the other, the other sort of parties and bring in an expert, a historian, to talk about this event and to give reflection and to put it aside. And this was a massive conversation. So when we first started making the film, there was myself and two other Nubaq storytellers and media makers. One became a filmmaker or was studying film at that point, and one is a theater director and a writer. So it was Andrew Ochberham McLean and Kathy Rexford. And they were both in the middle of school, so they sort of went off to school in the middle of the project, but they were really pivotal at setting the direction of that film in the beginning. And we had these huge conversations about whether or not we do that, because the sort of set formula for historical documentaries is interview the participants, then, collect, footage and scenes and videos in whatever capacity, whether you're collecting modern stuff or you're doing reenactments, or you're doing lots of historical things as, documents and movies and photos and various different things you can find. And then also go to the established experts, and they're the voice that guide you through the story, the established historians or the established commentators on this space. And our problem was the commentators and the historians that were recognized commentators and historians were non-Inupiaq commentators and historians. And we had started off on this project with the very, very specific remit by our elders and by our community to tell the part of history that is not seen, to tell the part of history that's not told, to tell the whole of history and the rest of it. And for us, that was the Inupiaq perspective and the Inupiaq experience of this history. And so we, went back and forth, and it was an interesting point in my development as a filmmaker, because I was really quite very sure that I wanted to preference the elders, and that I knew if we put up somebody from a university of blah, blah, blah with the title historian or professor or PhD at the end of their name, I knew as soon as I put that person up next to an Inupiaq elder, the gravity that Inupiaq elder had on screen was going to be diminished. And I felt really, really strongly that in this particular project, that was the worst, that would be a good way to destroy the power of the film and the power of what we were doing. So we decided not to do that. We did end up going to we went to a Fish and Wildlife officer that had been involved, and we got his story, but he doesn't narrate the film. He's not the core person. We put a narrator on instead to cover some of those historical elements. And even that narrator had an Inupiaq voice, an Inupiaq hunter's voice, because that's who the film was being made for. It was being made for Inupiaq kids in school. And the impact that film had in our community, first of all, in our schools, we were so just blown away and thrilled with the fact that, we did all this work. We released this film, we stuck it in the schools, we screened it at film festivals. It was very, very low budget. If you watch the film, we would sometimes land in villages. We had a half an hour on a camera. We didn't have time to set up lights, and very low production quality, but very powerful stories that all these people shared with us. And we thought, oh, what's going to happen? We haven't fast edited, we haven't put music on it, we haven't done all this stuff. It's subtitles, with kids. And we put it into, it did well in the festival circuit. It won a couple of awards. We were very thankful for that. But we put it into the schools, and the teachers came to us and said, do you have any more content? Can we have, our kids, we have children who would walk out of school. We have children who are not coming to school, teenagers who are not coming to school, and they're sitting through the entire class, watching the whole thing, engaging in the conversation, and they want more, they want to hear more of this stuff. Can we have some more content? Can we have more of this? And then we'd go to the villages and we'd say, how's the film going? Is it useful? What are the reactions you're getting? And they say, oh, we keep the film locked up in the principal's office. And I was like, why are you locking the film in the principal's office? And they said, because they keep stealing them. Because we had them in the library for a while and they just never come back. And we're not sure if it's the kids or the communities that are taking these DVDs, but we can't hold on to them and we need them for the class. So we have them locked in the principal's office. And I said, put them back in the library. I'll send you more copies if they get disappeared. The whole idea is that for this to be seen. And so the initial reactions from the schools and the students were exactly what we were going for. We wanted to engage that part of our children that got them to, one, see something that was relevant to their experience and to their understanding and to their histories, and to just spoke to to their life. And two, we wanted to start to engage them critically in these kind of bigger issues as an Inupiaq community, and bigger issues as our relationship with the outside community. But the things that started happening after that were the other things that kind of kept propelling us forward to find more funds to keep doing this history series. Because what we started to see is that not only was it also, we were getting requests for it to be used in universities, and we were developing a curriculum unit to go with it for schools. And that was really encouraging. But we started to see it be referenced in the public life of our community. So our leaders and various politicians and various hunters, they were referencing the story that had gone out of consciousness. The Duckin was not in conversation when we made that film. I remember going to one of the elders' houses to record his story, and he'd been involved. I should tell you the story. Sorry, I just realized I haven't told anybody the story of the Duckin. Sorry about that, 7 o'clock in the morning. So the story of the Duckin, it happened in the 1960s, and it was the first attempt by the federal government to regulate Inupiaq subsistence hunting. So we're a subsistence hunting community. And, when I was growing up, 80% of the food that I ate was Inupiaq food. It came off of something that my family and community hunted or fished or caught or traded or shared. And still today, like Moama was saying, it's Nalakatak right now. People are out at a subsistence hunting festival. We're still very, very tied to that aspect of our being and our way of being in the Arctic, which is hunting and fishing. It's the core of what it is to be Inupiaq, as an Inupiaq person on Inupiaq country is subsistence hunting. And in the 1960s, the federal government, they had previously signed these treaties around duck hunting, which said you can only hunt ducks in America at these certain times. And the times they had laid out were not the times that ducks were present in Alaska. So or in our part of Alaska. And in my research, this is not in the film, but in my research, I remember finding this reference because I thought, oh my gosh, did they just do this and they didn't know what they were doing? And I found this letter from the negotiator for this treaty between Alaska, Canada, and Russia, from memory. Alaska, Canada, Russia, Mexico signed on later. And he absolutely knew that Inupiaqs hunted at that time of year. He just didn't believe that we should have the right to hunt. So he just didn't think it was important to make any exceptions for Inupiaq hunters to be able to hunt food. Now, so there was this treaty that made it illegal for decades. There'd been this treaty that made it illegal to hunt in the Arctic, but no United States government entity had tried to do anything about it, because for various different reasons. We were very far away, we were very strong, we were very dependent on hunting. I mean, there was one tiny store in town that sold, you know, barely any fresh meat. And at the time when the ducks come back in Alaska, when they come back up to Alaska, we're waiting for, you know, the same time that the whales are coming. We've just survived a winter time with not a lot. You know, the Arctic is a harsh place to live. There's not a lot of resources up there. So you're just holding on to the last of what you got. And then ducks arrived and whales arrived and all the summer animals arrive and you can start hunting again. So duck hunting is really, really important. And it was really, really important at that point in time. Never mind all the social, cultural, spiritual, and emotional aspects of hunting, but just let's talk about the literal ones. And so the federal agency said to the state, the newly formed state of Alaska, we're going to come up and enforce this treaty, enforce this law, because the Inupiats are hunting these ducks and they shouldn't be allowed to hunt these ducks. And I think, you know, in the background was, what about our game hunters in the lower 48? They're going to hunt them before they get to lower 48, right? And the state of Alaska, Federal Fish and Game Wildlife, who knew a little bit more about the lay of the land, said, this is not a good idea. We don't think this is a good idea. And they did it anyway. So they showed up in my community where I'm from, in Nunavik, and arrested 2 hunters. One of them was later on to become a state representative, and the other one was whaling captain. So they arrested 2 of the most, you know, important leaders in our community who were hunting ducks at the time, took their guns, took their ducks, and, you know, got them ready to go to jail. Well, the next day, 300, like almost every single man in town and woman of age showed up at the Fish and Game Wildlife Officer's hotel with a duck to be arrested. So they very quickly organized themselves and said, well, if you're going to arrest one, you're going to have to arrest all of us. You're going to have to figure out what to do with all these kids whose parents you've just arrested for trying to feed them. And so he then had to process 300 something, I think it was like 318 or something, 300 duck hunters for hunting illegal ducks. And it was this massive, you know, social, what's the word? You know, like a peaceful protest. Resistance act that then was like hit all of the newspapers, it hit all of the media. They sent messages at that point, you know, used to send audio tapes all over. So they sent audio tapes to church groups on the East Coast. They sent audio tapes to media groups. So it was just all over the country. Inupiaq hunters arrested for trying to feed their children. And that was the story that went out. So it was the story of these, you know, Inupiaq hunters who were just trying to feed their families who were being arrested by the federal government. And there was a huge response to it. And the subsequent action was that we were able to protect subsistence hunting. We were able to get an exception in there. We were able to kind of push for this sort of resistance. So that was the story we were telling. And that was the story we were documenting in the film. And it's a very, very powerful and pivotal moment in Inupiaq history, but it was nowhere to be seen in public life, and it was nowhere to be seen in the education. It was nowhere to be seen in our storytelling, because at that time, the only storytelling we had was through news, Inupiaq news, through the local radio station and a newspaper, which was, you know, those initiatives I can talk about later, which were quite powerful initiatives, but they were current. They weren't referencing these points. And when we were making the film, that is. And we went into, you know, we were going into his elder's house, and I remember going into the elder's house and we were filming the story, and he was talking about showing up with a duck the next day, and what he would, you know, the fear of like, am I going to be arrested? What's going to happen to my children? You know, they didn't know what was going to happen. They just knew that they had to resist this. They didn't know it was going to work out. They could have very easily just been picked up and flown out. You know, most of them were boarding school kids that had been forcibly, you know, had been sent off to boarding school. And we finished the interview with this elder, and his grandsons walked in the room, and they looked at us without, this isn't a village, so they looked at us. We had a whole camera set up. We had actually had time to set up lights then and microphone, and we were sitting there. We couldn't sit and looked at the 3 of us from another village. They didn't know who we were, because they were quite young. We knew who their grandfather was. And they said, why are you filming my appa? Like, what on earth could my appa have to tell you that is so important that you've got a film crew? Like, you know, film's very sort of sexy medium. Why are you filming with my appa? Who are you and what are you doing here? You know? And we said, well, your appa was one of the people that was involved in this really important part of our history. Didn't you know the story of the duck? And I said, the duck what? You know, they had never heard of it. And so it was just this, you know, it was this moment for me of going, wow, that's how quickly we can lose this history. That's how fast it can slip through this sort of collective, the collective knowledge of a people if we don't maintain and reinforce and strengthen our own storytellers and use these new tools in Inupiaq ways, in native ways. And that was just to illustrate that, once that film was out there and we sort of triggered that memory on a collective front of this event, and we reinforce that memory for next generations. I've seen it used in public policy conversations. I've seen it referenced, the film sometimes, but the story, the more important thing for me was that the story was brought back to life and that history was brought back to life so that we could use it as learning points and as things to organize ourselves with and as strength for who we are. Because in the world that we live in, we need as much of that as possible as we're struggling to kind of navigate our way through a colonial existence. So anyways, that was a long way of illustrating a very simple point that I'm sure everybody's aware of. Are there any questions, since I'm just sort of rabbiting on?
I just have a comment, just to kind of bookend what you were just talking about, the kids wondering why you were filming their appa. I cannot show the duck-in now without any Inupiat who is in the room telling me who they are related to in that film every time, and that becomes an interesting discussion. So I think it's kind of nice to see that that complete change from why are you filming grandpa to that's my grandpa.
Yes.
Anyway.
That is, thanks, Daniel. That's lovely, and that was our experience as well. And I remember, we have an alternative program school in Kelvik called KITA, and they are some kids that just the mainstream has dropped. The mainstream school system doesn't do it for them, and so there was this amazing initiative started in the 90s. And when they got the film, The Duck-In, they came to us and said, do you have any more of those extras? And I said, I haven't subtitled the extras because a lot of the interviews are in Inupiaq and the kids don't speak. And they said, that doesn't matter. They said, we have kids in our class who watched the whole film and then they watched every single, because I decided to put extra interviews, these powerful interview moments on the very first DVD. We put all these extras on. And I just didn't have enough time or resources to do all the subtitles. And so I just put them on, almost like unedited. They just run through, they fade up and there's like 25 comments. There's not even video over them. They're just talking heads. It's like the most, simple form. It's not even filmmaking. It's just sort of, here's some outtakes that we had from interviews because they were such powerful stories that the elders had told and I wanted people to have access to them. And the internet was, still sort of getting itself working then. And I put them up onto these DVDs, and these high school kids who, were just really, the school system was not doing it for them, would watch this. And then they watched all of the interviews, all of the extras without understanding everything they were saying. And it was just that, need to see the representation and to hear that validation and to see the empowerment of their elders and the empowerment of Inupiaq storytelling, which is something that I think film is particularly well positioned to do. I'm writing this article for a magazine in the UK about this. They've asked me to write about Indigenous filmmaking. And it's one of the things that occurred to that I was sort of reflecting on when I was writing it, and that I've often talked about when I work with teachers and teach programs using film and digital media for engaging minority kids back with their community using storytelling. And it's the thing, in a very short period of time, simply by putting the faces of elders up there and empowering them to tell their own voices, you can destroy for that moment the negative impacts of colonization, the negative impacts of oppression, the negative impacts of racism. Because for that moment, you get to say, this is equally valid. And in fact, this is more important for you to know and ground yourself in before you spread yourself out to the rest of the world and try to go to these other places. There's a core here of who you are that you get to see as valid on these platforms that mean something to you. Because, when we look at our world today, I mean, I'm speaking to you right now from another country over a Zoom link on video, like our worlds are infused with this media and this is how we communicate now. And so if as Native people, we don't have proper representation, and I don't just mean, Native people on the screen, but I mean stories, like authentic Inupiaq, authentic Native stories and characters and settings and solutions and images and ways of organizing ourselves on these mediums, then effectively we're perpetuating, you know, or for our children, the landscape that our children are growing up in has a perpetuation of that deletion of the native being, the native ways of being on those screens. So that is why, you know, filmmaking for me has been so important. And that's why, because when I started making film, I wanted to do dramas. But, you know, there was no way that I was going to say no to my elders asking me to come home and do these films. And that's why they're more important to me than my own sort of written films and my own stories, is that, you know, something I can give back to all of the people in the community that's raised me, and something I can give forward. Because I now have 3 children, so I want them to see themselves reflected, you know, in these meetings. I want them to hear these stories and know this history. So yeah, so that's sort of my start, and that was the history series. Any other questions? I'm just rabbited on about one film the whole time.
Can I jump in real quick? I'm David McDonald up in Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College in Cloquet, Minnesota. I made a big mistake and I joined the website redesign committee for our school. As a big mistake, because everybody has an opinion. But one of the interesting things that they're talking about is they wanted to have more of a, because we're a tribal and community college, have more of a tribal, the indigenous presence on the website. And today, one member of the committee brought up a point about how to achieve that goal, but taking into consideration the concept of deficit culture. And I was wondering if, when you're doing filmmaking, are you ever concerned about not just telling a story the way it was originally designed, but if there's some of this deficit culture kind of thing seeps into the thinking, as like decolonization, stuff like that? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. Yes, so on my other hat, in the work that my partner and I do between institutions and communities, we do a lot of work in sort of practice, professional development for leadership and organization institutions practitioners, and we work in a space around cultural safe and responsive practice. And cultural safety is a model of working that comes out of New Zealand. It's a Maori designed model, and I won't go too much into that, but it essentially works off of 2 core pillars. One is that, you know, the acceptance and acknowledgement and commitment to work to mitigate the impact on affected communities of the bias and oppression that is riddled through the systems that have raised all of us. So in understanding that there is bias and acknowledgement that there is that bias, and acknowledgement that that bias creates harmful impact and manifests in how we do our practice, and a commitment to work intensively to address where that sits and what we can do about it. And then the second pillar is agency for the communities to drive and design their own solutions in whatever field. So, you know, it comes out of health. We do it in education and in arts and in government and in economics and in health as well, like in all of these other spaces where we're asked in by communities to come and do this kind of work, or by organizations. Preferably, you know, we only go if they both want to do it. So the reason I reference that is that, you know, there's sort of a model of working that we've developed as a result. Both of us come out of filmmaking and that storytelling, the power of storytelling, and that impact of deficit narrative. So we use it as a fundamental pillar in doing that work, beginning to understand the difference between deficit and strength-based narratives, and the complexity that you can have trauma and strength coexist, right? And so how do you hold that complexity in your practice when you're designing a website, when you're making a film, when you're teaching a class, when you're addressing issues? How do you hold that complexity of the traumas that exist for our communities, but ensure that the way you're constructing, the way you're doing whatever you're doing has a strength-based aspect to it? And deficit narratives are a really, really powerful illustration of that. So I'm not entirely sure what the other person on the committee that you're talking about was saying about deficit narratives, but I think if I made an educated guess, it would be about how the indigenous community from that area is being talked about. And I have been to your country, so I should know. So I will apologize for dropping out of my head what the actual name of the indigenous community in northern Minnesota. My mother's from Minnesota, so I should really know. is. But that filter of being able to look at the way we're talking about our communities, the way we talk about ourselves, the way we present our communities, and the way we present tricky parts of our history, and ensuring that the way that we're presented, the way that it's presented is always bringing, I think, sorry, let me just back up a second. I think when you look at these issues of representation and you look at it, filmmaking is a really useful tool to think about the perspective that we're coming at it from, right? And the narrative that we've been told. So we've all been told a particular part of history, a particular story of Native people, a particular perspective of how we think about Indigenous people on the North American continent, right? And that story is often very, very little. There's often very little about First Nations people in any spaces. You know, you can't open up the newspaper really up until the last couple of years. Very rarely could you open up the newspaper and find anything about First Nations people in North America in any capacity, right? So it's often almost none. It's often stops at a certain point in colonization, like here are these Native people and they existed this way, and then colonization hit and then they just disappear. Out of it's like all of a sudden they just died off, you know, they lost the war and they were died off. It's almost always deficit based. They lost this, we lost that, we lost this, we lost that, we were killed off, we were forced, like it's always those things. And a lot of those things are true, like there's truth in that history, but there's a missing story always, every time I look at any history or any story or any representation, there's always a missing story. And when there was this great piece of research, if I find it, I'll send it off to you guys, around the way that history is told in the United States, the way that Native history and Native people are presented in various spaces, which went through all of these deficits. And it's phenomenal to look at this research. But anyways, the missing story that is always lacking is the story of resistance, right? The story of empowerment and the story of resistance. And the reason that story is missing is because until we reconcile our spaces in the public conversation and the consciousness of the American and Native American space, the resistance is still quite scary, because the resistance, if you're a Native person, says you're on Native country, this is Native land, that there's an inappropriate relationship here. And so it's easy to ignore that resistance because of the fear of what it means, because we don't know how to navigate these conversations. We don't know how to reconcile ourselves to our history. But the problem with when you're trying to do strength-based stuff is you can't do a strength-based story without recognizing that and include that the trauma or the reality of these tricky things that we're navigating as communities. You can't do that unless you can trigger the fact that there is a strength and a resistance in the community, unless you can also tell that story. So it's, yes, our boarding school story, our language story, yes, we are almost about to lose our language, right? But look at everything that we're doing. Look at how hard we're fighting for it. Look at all the desire by these young people to know their language. Look at the power. If we trigger this power in our people, look at what can happen. So I'm not sure if that helps. I probably need to probably need to know a bit more about detail of what on the website they're looking at in terms of deficit, but I would imagine it's along the lines of presenting the continuation of the Indigenous people of that area, and the continuation of those stories, and the presence and the today presence of what they look like. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's great. And if you don't mind, I'm going to share your answer with the committee, because no, just because you're hitting on a lot of things that we all need to continually take into consideration as we try to make these decisions. And it's not always clear. If you might have good intentions, but you're actually looking at it through a deficit only eyes sort of thing. Just on a quick note, it was about whether we should use the term affordable for the going to the college. And that led to, oh, is it just for poor Indians? That's why you're saying it's affordable. And that led to the whole, let's discuss where we're headed, where we're coming from. But no, I appreciate that. And I think Al did succeed in recording this, so I'm going to definitely get that one over to them. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Sorry, that wasn't a very succinct answer. Happy to talk further to you about that afterwards. And that's a good conversation you guys are having. So it'll be interesting to see what you come up with. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good luck with that. I could probably say more about that. Any other questions? Or comments or thoughts? Anybody want to add to anything that I've said?
I think we're going to run a little bit over, which is fine. We normally go for an hour, and we can go longer if people would like and if you're available. And you've got so many important things to say and some great stories. I mean, we need you for another 3 or 4 hours at the very minimum. Um, if you're available to come back next week, I think we could schedule for another 5 o'clock, if you're available and if you're willing to do it. There's a lot of discussions to have. I mean, this is the Indigenous Digital Collective. The whole idea really is to do the things that you're talking about, you know, bringing the digital media voice or allowing communities to express themselves and their voice in whatever digital medium that they choose to use. And for us, tribal colleges, it's encouraging students at our colleges to do that. And so, yeah, we're totally on the same, in the same space here. Absolutely. So if anybody does have a question in the few minutes that we normally have, unless you want to run over a little bit, well, one question I would ask, maybe not to be answered today, because boy, you give some really rich responses, and I'm so glad that we did manage to get them recorded. You mentioned early on how the whole the film industry is so Western paradigm driven, and I kind of understood that to mean, you know, all of it, the way it's fun, the way things are funded, the way the stories are structured, you know, the whole thing is, you know, there's just patterns and paradigms, I guess, that are just that dictate how things are produced and how they're understood, how people respond to different media. How can that be decolonized? I mean, where are the points of you know, least resistance where you can start making a difference and shifting to something that's much more Indigenous driven and community driven?
That's a great question. That is actually what I thought I was going to talk about today, and I got distracted telling stories about the ducking. So that's what I've. So the film that Daniel referenced in the beginning, that In My Blood It Runs, it's an Australian film that I produced. I was a producer on it, creative producer. It's a long story. I won't go into that, but we've just been talking about this sort of ad nauseum over the last year as that film's been released, and that is the very nature of the work that my partner and I have done in film, is looking at how to unlearn and relearn different ways of making film and media content, and in partnership or grounded in community ways of being. And there's lots of great stories and examples of that. And I would actually thank you so much for the question, and thanks for the explanation. And I think to give a short answer, because I know everybody needs to go off to their dinners at 5 o'clock for some of you, and to your afternoons. I'm happy to speak further at other times, or possibly also to bring in other people. It's always great to hear from different voices. But I would say that, you know, in the decolonization of the art space and of the storytelling space and of the film and television spaces, it's actually going to the difficult areas that we need to go to. You know, the sort of low-hanging fruit. Lots of us are doing, you know, people are doing their best practice. We understand that there's, sorry. You know, and it's a really interesting, I mean, it's really great that you bring up the intent conversation, because in the work that we do when we do professional development in these spaces, or we do decolonization workshops around film and media or education or health or whatever it is, you know, the first thing we start with to kind of ground the situation, because it's often very confronting for people, is it's not a conversation about intent. Everybody is good people, you know, we're all good people. We all have good intent. I've never worked with anybody that wanted to do damage in the spaces that they were working. You know, very, very few people that I've worked with have I looked at them and gone, oh, I don't know if that your intent is really great. Everybody that I've worked with has great intent. So we have to move the conversation from this sort of good person, bad person binary that triggers in our head when we think about racism, or we think about oppression, or we think about inequity and injustice, to a conversation on impact, right? My intent might be the best intent in the world, but my impact on, what is the impact I'm having on the communities and the students I'm working with, right? And I can't understand that unless I relearn how to do things, and I relearn how to listen and how to sit with those experiences and how to bring that aid and how to recognize the agency of those students or of our communities inside what we're doing and adjust my practice so that even in my little sphere of influence, there's equity in how I'm doing things and I'm sharing power with how and what I'm doing. And so that would be my very short, quick answer to how to address that. And there's lots of ways of doing that, lots of different details of doing that. If you look at ISIMA TV in Canada, for example, they have a very community-based way of telling stories. That these are the people that brought you Atanarjwa, right? So there's a wonderful story about having community members who help build things, having community members who help drive the storytelling, having non-scripted stories as well, working with improv stories where you can bring in different types of intelligences that my partner has a lot of history in, and we've done some together, and having upsetting the traditional structures of how films are made and how power is balancing filmmaking. Who gets to be the director, who gets to be the writer, who gets to be the producer and the storyteller? What are they beholden to? So there's lots of really exciting ways of doing that work that I would strongly suggest that anybody who's teaching this go and look at for your students, because it's at the, it's finally coming to this point in our industry where these conversations are becoming mainstream. When I started making films 25 years ago, most people told me I wasn't allowed to be a filmmaker because I was a social justice filmmaker, because I wanted to do things differently, because I wanted to empower the elders in my community in storytelling, because I wanted to create a whole different structure for how we do things. And now the industry, now I'm being asked to speak about this way of doing things. So it's at the forefront of how we're talking about things in the film industry more generally. And you guys are in an amazing position to inspire that in your students and in the next media maker, the next film and television media makers that are coming out, so that they can come out a step ahead of everything else. And as Native, or if you are having a lot of Native or diverse students, or not even, all of your student base, like, it's an incredibly empowered position to start from. So more power to you. I really encourage you to keep going that way. I'm very happy to suggest other filmmakers, other media makers. I'm very happy to come and talk again, but I'm also happy to bring in other people that you can hear from.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And we are going to take you up on that. Starting next week. Normally, this is kind of a new format that we're experimenting with, where one week we have a presenter like you, and then the following week we have a discussion to get more into the weeds on the topic. So we'll follow that format next week. If you're available again at 5 o'clock at 7 a.m. local time, if you can do it.
Yes, I think we can do Tuesday next week, because at 7 a.m. it's an easier time to do. Yes.
and we'll continue next week and bring in others that you recommend. We have others that we can also bring, maybe put on a panel, something like that, and fill this whole summer with some really great content, some inspirational discussions.
Yeah, but thank you for that, and thanks for having me, and I'm sorry for grabbing you. I really wanted to hear more conversation from all of you in your spaces, so maybe next week we do that. We'll bring on another voice and we just hear more, or the week after that we can talk about how that works.
Yeah, we were going to do this 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, but it might be we're going to just have to keep going week after week. There's just too much to cover. Thank you so much. And thanks, Dan and Moema, for recommending Rachel. This has really been a great session, and we very much look forward to more.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel, so much.
Yeah, thank you. It was amazing.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Everybody have a great evening, and we'll see you next week.
You too. Have a good evening. Bye. Thank you guys for having me.
Bye.